Hello everyone, it's Alison here. I'm sorry I can't be with you for the full service today, but I have my own thing to run here at Sanctuary. So Nathan asked me to pre-record a sermon or two for you to be used in the time while he's away. Now I'm sure that Gilbert is rolling his eyes by now, since he tells me that every sermon should have wet ink on it. I have to admit this doesn't have wet ink. I also have to admit that a fresher sermon would have bounced off the text from Matthew. But given that you read all the set texts each week, and given how horrific the Abraham and Isaac story is, it's a text that we're going to tackle tonight. So here goes. All around the world today, people will be listening to the story of Abraham and Isaac. And the preachers will preach and the teachers will teach that Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his beloved son is a model of faith. And so we too are called to sacrifice everything for Jesus' sake, even if necessary, our own children. Well, some adults will nod wisely. They'll be thrilled by these demands. Others will feel sick to the stomach and maybe leave the faith. And any children who are paying attention will be horrified. They will wonder why anyone would want to worship a God, the sort of God who might ask their parents to hurt them. And this is an excellent question. Because the usual reading says that God might require the sacrifice of the vulnerable people who are entrusted to our care. And so this is why, for example, so many pastors and missionaries have felt able to work so hard and to sacrifice so much of their own children's childhoods. Myself, we were uprooted every 2 years, as my mother was called to each new church. Now, there were some wonderful things about that experience, but I found it to be incredibly difficult. And I think of my friends who were sent to boarding school overseas at the age of 4, so that their parents could work as missionaries, unencumbered by the burden of parenting. So is there another way of reading, though, that doesn't demand sacrifice? A reading which is more consistent with the God of love? Well, I think that there is, but it requires us to read the story carefully, thinking about its context and looking at language. And if we do this, I believe that we'll find that this is a story which celebrates life, not death, but life. So the first thing to draw to your attention is that the story was told at a time and in a context where the blood sacrifice of children was normal. It's hard for us to get our heads around it, but back then it was the right and good thing to do. In the ancient Middle East and in many other cultures, children were sacrificed to appease the gods. Indeed, the abduction and the ritual murder of children by sorcerers and witch doctors still happens in some countries today, most notably in Uganda. So we might feel revulsion at the story of Abraham and Isaac and the knife, but we need to understand that nobody hearing it for the first time would have raised an eyebrow. Abraham was doing the right thing. He was called to sacrifice his son, and he prepared to do so. The second thing I want to bring to your attention is the changing name of God in the story. It's often masked in the English translations. But the story opens with El, which is a generic word for God. El is the God that everyone knows, the God like all other gods. And it's this God who demands the sacrifice of Abraham's son. But it is Yahweh, or the Lord, who stays Abraham's hand. Yahweh is the personal and relational God revealed to Israel. And it's a messenger from Yahweh who calls to Abraham and says, "Do not harm the boy. Do not harm the boy." Well, the third thing to note is that when this God speaks, Abraham does something brave. He does something radical because he listens to this new voice, the voice which tells him not to harm his son, the voice which demands that he act differently to everybody else. The good, the right, and the normal thing would be for Abraham to sacrifice his son. But he does the harder thing. He comes back down the mountain and he brings the boy with him. And then you can imagine he probably has to try and convince all his neighbours and friends and relatives that he's done the right thing, while they no doubt are terrified. And they're terrified because in his failure to sacrifice the boy, maybe God will punish them all. We can get so caught up in the shocking thought that Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son that we can miss this point. In context, the shocking thing is that based on new information and a new understanding of God, Abraham did not sacrifice his son. And that is precisely the point. Followers of Yahweh, the God of Israel, do not sacrifice their children. And this is a major shift in theological understanding. It's so huge that it's hard for Israel to believe it. And so, as the history of Israel unfolds, people do fall back into child sacrifice from time to time. But every time the prophets rage against it, and gradually the refusal to sacrifice children becomes normal. Abraham was willing to give everything he had to God, and this is wonderful. But what is even more wonderful is the revelation that the God of Israel, Yahweh, does not demand destructive sacrifice. Now, this understanding grows, and it grows until much later. The prophets reveal that God does not even demand the sacrifice of animals. Instead, they say, God seeks only justice and mercy and kindness and peace. In other words, anything which demands a sacrifice of children or other vulnerable people is not the God of Israel, our God. Instead, it is a false God. It is an idol. Now, it's a great thing that we all get this. Or do we? Actually, we don't. In this world, we sacrifice children, our children and other people's children, to idols and ideals all the time. At the extreme end, all over the world, children are in armies, and they're in sex shops, and they're kept out of school, and they're sacrificed to idols of militarism and violence and the patriarchy and human desire, adult desire. Children slave in cocoa and coffee plantations, and they work in factories and sweatshops, making our clothes and the food that we eat. And they're sacrificed to the idol of consumerism and our lust for consumer goods. In the US, a whole lot of labour laws are being changed to enable children to work in heavy industry. And closer to home, young children have recently been found to be working in fast food joints. They are all sacrificed to the idol of cheap labour and the pressures of avoidable poverty. Meanwhile, children here as young as 10 are thrown into jail for minor offences and for breaches of bail. Even young children are kept in solitary confinement. Indigenous children bear the brunt of this, and they are all sacrificed to the idols of law and order. What else? Children seeking asylum, well, they live in the hell of visa limbo, sacrificed to the idols of national sovereignty and border control. Autistic children are removed from mainstream classrooms, sacrificed to the idols of normality and political games. Same-sex attracted children and transgender children are turned into political pawns. They're bullied at school and excluded from churches, sacrificed to the idol of heteronormative ways of being. Children, all children, are kept out of many church services, and they're being sacrificed to this idea or this idol of well-ordered, quiet, rational, cerebral forms of worship. And don't even get me started on the thousands and thousands of children who have been sacrificed to priests and the power and reputation of the church. In private homes, children are given the dregs of their parents' time, energy, and focus. They've been sacrificed to the idols of careerism and me time. And children are fought over by controlling adults, divorcing parents, sacrificed to the idols of adult egos and needs. And anyone who's been watching Succession has seen just how horrifically this can play out. So this is all to say we might not slaughter children on stone idols, on stone altars, but children are sacrificed all the time to the demands and the values of our society. But our God is the God of life, the one who says, do not harm the child. Our God will watch as we lay our children down upon the altars of militarism or consumerism or heteronormativity or ego or status or money, but just when all seems lost, our God will demand that we stay our hand. And we choose. We choose which voice we listen to. We can choose to act like everyone else, sacrificing children to ideals and idols in our society's rapacious greed. Or we can choose to live differently. We can risk people's approbation, people's criticism, and seek to get children off plantations and out of sweatshops, and to free children from detention, and to educate and feed all children, and to honour children's needs when our work demands escalate or our relationships break down, and to care for the planet for the sake of our children's children, and to welcome all children into our lives and our churches, however noisy or messy or uncomfortable they make us and our lives become. We can opt for the violence of normal life, the life that is a living death, or we can choose for the God of life, the one who demands only justice, mercy, kindness, and peace, and who in human form placed a little child at the center of things and told his disciples to do likewise. Sacrificing children, it's the default setting. It's the easy option. But if you seek the God of life, the God here revealed in tonight's story to Abraham, you must live differently. You must come down the mountain and face the harsh criticism of the people of the tents, your relatives perhaps, or your neighbours, your employers, your politicians, other people in your congregation, even at times your priests. They'll call you perhaps a hippie do-gooder or a bleeding heart, naive. They'll accuse you of undermining family values. They'll mock how you raise your children and how you worship and work and shop and play. But don't be afraid. You won't be alone. Because when you walk down that mountain, you'll be walking slowly, dawdling, and listening to chatter. For you'll be hand in hand with a little child who trusts you to do just as God asks. Amen.